ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Before we start today's story, we're very excited to share that tickets for Conversations Live, our national tour, are selling fast. Extra shows have been added in Adelaide, Hobart and Perth. We've got a wonderful show planned for you with special guests, memorable moments and a few surprises along the way. Sarah and I would love to see you. There's a link in the show notes, or you can go to the Conversations page for more details. Hugh White is back on Conversations today. Hugh is an Australian defence analyst, and he's Emeritus Professor of Strategic Studies at the ANU. He was the principal author of Australia's 2000 Defence White Paper. Last time Hugh was here was 2019. Since then, stuff, as they say, has happened. COVID, the creation of AUKUS, the Biden administration, change of government here in Australia, the return of Donald Trump to the White House, and all the tumult that's followed from that. Hugh White says that it's easy to get fixated on all the noise and drama coming out of the Trump administration. Its hostility to America's traditional democratic allies, Trump's admiration for Putin and Xi Jinping, his threats to Canada and Greenland and Panama, and his frontal assault on the global trading system. Hugh says it's more important right now to understand the deeper forces that are churning away underneath all of this. Because, he says, we're entering a new order of world power. The post-Cold War world, where America was the predominant global power, has gone for good. We now live in a multipolar world and a multipolar Asia. America, he says, for all its bluster, is backing away from this region and has been doing so for more than a decade. And Australia must accept this if we are to make our way in this new world. Now, none of this was discussed in the recent federal election, which makes Hugh's message so timely and urgent. He was written a quarterly essay, and it's called Hard New World, Our Post-American Future. Welcome back, Hugh.
Nice to be with you again, Richard.
Now, if we dial back the calendar, back a whole quarter of a century, back to the year 2000, it's the last year of the Clinton administration, second term of the Howard government, 25 years ago. This is pre the September 11 attacks. When we look at the year 2000, what kind of a sweet spot did Australia find itself in back in that year?
Well, I think it's a great way to frame this conversation because I think many of us are still kind of, including our political leaders, are still fixated on that as normal. That was a world in which America was the unchallenged primary power. It was a world in which America's position in Asia was completely uncontested, in which America underwrote an extraordinary era of free trade, the flourishing of democracies around the world. I think historians will look back and see 2000 as the sweet spot, and I think we still have a kind of assumption that that's what we should be expecting in future. And I guess a big part of my message is that no, that was then, this is now. A whole lot of different forces, domestically in the United States, internationally in terms of the redistribution of wealth and power, politically in terms of the way authoritarian regimes have failed to democratise as we hoped back then. In all of these ways, we're living in a much harder world, and yet our political system and our political leadership is still, I think, hankering for a world which has passed away. And I think we will not manage to make our way in this new world unless we recognise what it is.
And back in 2000, John Howard was Prime Minister, and he said famously, Australia doesn't have to choose between our history and our geography. We can keep our ties with the Americans even while we live and trade with Asia. How well does that formula work now?
Well, not very well at all. I think, as is often the case, what John Howard was doing was articulating not a credible expectation, but a hope. And hope is not a policy, unfortunately. The fact is that that was true. It was true that Australia didn't have to choose between America and China as long as America and China were not strategic rivals. And back in 2000 they weren't, because back in 2000 China still accepted America as the primary power in this part of the world. But what happened in between then and now, in fact around about 2008, 2010, China stopped accepting America's place as a leading power in the region and started to contest America's position, started the long, slow process of pushing America out of the region and taking its place. And that's been going on now for a very long time. Australian political leaders have kept on saying we don't have to choose between America and China. And I think that's one of the key problems that we face at the moment is we still hope that somehow we can continue to rely on America to keep us safe, rely on China to make us rich, without recognising that their strategic objectives in the region are fundamentally incompatible, and that in the light of that, I think America is pulling away. I think America is stepping back from the region.
And we're 6 months into what it looks like the most radical US administration of our time, this administration that's dismantling the structure that it itself built after the Second World War. What have you been thinking watching the second Trump administration at work, Hugh?
Well, look, I think there are two aspects to this, Richard. The first is that we are reminded yet again, stronger than ever, just what a revolutionary figure Donald Trump is in domestic American politics. Because he fills our screens and our news feeds every day so much, we lose a sense of bewilderment and, I might say, dismay at what he's doing to the fabric of American political life. And what's more, what his success shows about the underlying weakness of America's political institutions. The fact that he's been able to transform and degrade American political and national life in such a spectacular way shows how weak both, for example, the Republican Party, which he has kind of taken over as a wholly owned subsidiary, and the Democratic Party, which has completely failed to respond to him effectively. Both of these great national institutions in the US and the courts, and you might say the media and the bureaucracy, have failed to find ways to respond to the Trump challenge. So I think we need to accept that, unlike the perhaps hopes that people had after he lost to Joe Biden back in 2020, we now have to see what Trump is doing to American political life as, in some sense, the new normal. And the second part of it is that Trump is validating and re-energising a view of America's role in the world, which is astonishingly different from the kind of view that we had back in 2000, where we saw America as the selfless but all-powerful leader of a stable and broadly benign international order. We see an America which is predatory itself and which tolerates predatory conduct by other great powers, which accepts other great powers as significant players in their own right. Putin's Russia, Xi Jinping's China, acknowledges their right to a sphere of influence just as it asserts its own right to a sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere with ever-increasing vigour and aggression. So I think it's truly revolutionary, and I think we make a big mistake to imagine, as I think our political leaders tend to do, that somehow we can keep dealing with Trump as if he's just another American president.
Or as an aberration that will go away and then
Exactly.
America will go back to normal again.
Exactly.
Will America ever go back, to your mind, to what it once was? Or can it ever go back, even if it wanted to go back to what it once was?
Look, I'm sure it can, Richard, in theory, but I just don't see what the path is. If we look ahead at the presidential election that will be coming up in 2028, if Trump or his successor doesn't win it, then it's hard to see how he will fail to contest it with all the means available to him, and after another term in power, the levers he'll have available to him to try and overturn an outcome he doesn't like will be even more powerful than the ones he attempted to use back in 2020. So I think just on the grounds of can he or his movement be voted out of office, it's very unclear. And I do think that we need to accept that America is going to function very differently for a long time to come.
You say his trade policies, his Liberation Day, his tariff policies, which have probably changed during the course of the hour in which we're talking here, are an act of national self-harm in the United States. Nonetheless, you say, his vision of a new strategic order, with that, he's actually swimming with the tide of history. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, look, it's a really important point. I do think it's, when we look at the way Trump approaches the world, it's important to distinguish the economic agenda from the strategic agenda, as he does himself, I think. The economic agenda, the tariffs, the attempts to sort of isolate America and turn it into a kind of self-sufficient protectionist haven, I think is pretty well doomed to fail, because in the end the forces of globalisation are very strong. You can build iPhones in the United States if you want to, but they're going to cost a lot more and they're not going to work as well as the iPhones that are built in China. And in the long run, I think the bond market, if nothing else, will push back against that. So I think he's on the wrong side of history there. The strange thing about Trump's strategic perceptions, his vision of America as a global leader politically and strategically, is actually more in keeping with current realities than Joe Biden's was. Joe Biden still saw America as the America of back in 2000. the America that was unchallengeably preponderant in every dimension of national power and could reassert its global leadership, could confront China's challenge and confront Russia's challenge and push them back into their boxes and retain and enhance a US-led global order. Now, that's the way Biden talked, for example, when he said, as he often did, that he was determined to win the contest against China for the 21st century. Now, the problem with that is not that it's not an attractive vision. Personally, I think that would be a very good world to live in, just as we felt it was in 2000. The problem with it is that the fundamentals of global politics, in particular the fundamental distribution of wealth and power, has shifted massively as China and India in particular have grown from being a tiny fraction of America's GDP to a very real competitors with the United States, including, of course, not just in terms of raw GDP, but technologically and increasingly militarily. So I think America under Biden failed to adapt to the fact that we've moved from a unipolar to a multipolar world. And that was dangerous because Biden failing to respond to those changed realities meant that America was pushing against the trends of history, and it raised, amongst other things, it raised the risk of a really serious war, particularly here in Asia. Trump, on the other hand, for all his creepiness, his vision of America's role in the world is essentially one that's consistent with multipolarity. It's the vision of America as one of a number of great powers in a much more complex global order, which is not dominated by a single player. Now, I think Trump's vision of how that should work is very unsettling because he does see those great powers operating in a very predatory fashion. But the fact that he accepts that China and Russia, and for that matter other countries like India, are going to be great powers in their own right is a significant step forward, is a significant step towards us making the transition from a unipolar to a multipolar order peacefully rather than via conflict. And I do think avoiding major power war is a very, very high priority.
Now, when you stand back and look over the long term, centuries long term with America, one of its founding principles the United States' founding principles was isolationism. It was like, we don't want to get caught up in foreign entanglements, was a thing that was said many, many times throughout the 19th century. And you say the thing that pulled America out of that to let it to become a global leader was the danger of Eurasia being dominated by a single power. Firstly, Nazi Germany, then the Soviet Union. And so are we living in this world where, after the Cold War and the implosion of the Soviet Union, where that reason, that fundamental strategic reason based on self-interest for the United States to be a global power, that's just kind of gone? Is that your argument, Hugh?
Yes, exactly. That's exactly it, Richard. These are centuries-long transitions we're seeing, and so we have to stand back a bit from the day-to-day dramas to see the big shifts that are underway. In the 19th century, when America was isolationist, when America just stuck to the Western Hemisphere and said, we don't care what happens out there on the other side of the Pacific or the Atlantic Oceans, that was a sensible policy for the United States, because America is inherently a very secure country, as long as no power elsewhere in the world has got sufficient strength to project itself across either the Atlantic or the Pacific Oceans, and you have to be a very powerful country to do that. In the 19th century, America would be very sure that no rival would acquire that kind of strength, because there were so many players in Asia, in Europe, particularly from the European imperial powers themselves. There was a balance of power in Eurasia. Now, what went wrong for all of us really in the 20th century was that balance of power broke down. A succession of powers, first the Germans, then the Soviets, appeared on the verge of acquiring enough power to dominate the whole of Eurasia themselves. And this became the great theme of American strategic policy throughout the 20th century: prevent at all costs the emergence of a Eurasian hegemon. That's what the Second World War was all about for America. That's what the Cold War was all about for America. Now, as we've moved into the 21st century, we're going back to a multipolar world that's much more like the 19th century. There are lots of powerful countries now. There's China, there's India, there's Russia, there's Europe, which is emerging as a sort of united, coherent strategic entity itself, particularly as they face the decline of American interest. And there's also Japan, there's Indonesia, which is a country we should pay a lot more attention to. It will be the fourth biggest economy in the world well before the middle of the century. So I think we're moving back into a world where America doesn't have to fear the emergence of the Eurasian hegemon, therefore doesn't have to fear that if it doesn't interfere in the rest of the world, a threat from the rest of the world will emerge towards it. So it makes sense again for America to return to the kind of isolationism that worked for it so well in the 19th century. And I think that's the big factor. The costs and risks to America of trying to intervene in areas like Asia or Europe are much higher, and the imperatives for them to do so are much lower. And that's why America is stepping back, because it's a different world.
All this has come as a profound shock to Europe. Now, my ears pricked up a couple of years ago during the Biden administration when President Macron of France said, seemingly out of the blue, he described NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, the defence alliance between European nations, the United States and Canada that's been in place since the Cold War. He described it as a brain-dead institution. Trump appears to have just simply turned off life support on NATO. What state is NATO in now? How does Europe now recover from a state where European nations can't believe the existing guarantees that remain for the United States to come to their aid should they be threatened by an outside power like Russia? Where does this leave Europe now, Hugh?
Look, I think Europe is in a very revolutionary transitional position, just like Australia is. The difference is the Europeans are starting to understand it. I mean, if you go back to the origins of NATO, exactly as you said, it goes all the way back to 1949. America committed itself to defend Western Europe from the Soviet Union because it feared that if the Soviet Union dominated Western Europe, it would dominate the whole of Eurasia and be able to threaten the United States. And that was the great idea that underpinned America's determination to bear any burden and pay any price to defend Western Europe all through the Cold War. After the Cold War, everyone expected that NATO would collapse. But the fact is, because America went through this optimistic moment, we thought we were in that world of 2000 where America could effortlessly continue to maintain some sort of global leadership because no one would really oppose them. The Europeans all got used to the idea that America was going to keep defending them in the post-Cold War world. Now, that's what they've now woken up to, the fact that it's not happening. And I think when Macron used that formula about NATO being brain dead, which, like you, I found very striking, I think he was acknowledging that the underlying strategic rationale for the United States to defend Europe at a time when Europe can easily defend itself from a power like Russia, because today Russia is much weaker than the Soviet Union was, and Europe is much, much stronger. And the idea that Europe today has to defend on the United States when Europe's GDP is something like 10 times the size of Russia's, when Europe's population is bigger than Russia's, where it has huge fundamental resources in technology and, of course, in quite formidable militaries, despite what everybody says. Europe no longer has to rely on the United States. The United States no longer has the strategic imperatives to defend Europe. And so, if you like, the underlying rationale for NATO has disappeared long ago. It's just been nostalgia and emotion which have kept it going. Now, I think this is a strange thing to say, but I think Trump has done the Europeans a favour by drawing their attention to the fact that the rationale of NATO has disappeared, and Europe faces the challenge of building its own strategic identity. Now, this is a big challenge politically. They do have to build the political structures which would allow the European members of NATO to act together as a strategic entity.
But do they need a leader for that, though, Hugh?
They do. I think the biggest gap in the European strategic personality is the fact that no one's in charge. And the question is, well, who can lead? And there are really only two possibilities. One is you have some sort of bureaucratic collective process like they have in Brussels to lead the EU. And anyone who knows the EU realises that that's not a very appealing prospect. The alternative is that you have to have a country to take the lead. And of course, when you look at the map of Europe, when you look at the history of Europe, it's Germany. The only country that can lead Europe strategically is Germany, partly because Germany is the strongest of the countries, and partly, of course, because it's in the centre. Its central location in Europe is critical here.
But if I'm Poland, Hugh, if I'm Poland, right on the border with Russia, I'm a country that's been invaded many times by Russia and occupied by Russia over the past 3 centuries.
And a few times by Germany too.
And a few times by Germany as well. But I think I'd be looking at Germany going, there's not the political will there to be the leader of Europe. Yeah. France has offered to extend its nuclear umbrella, but no one imagines France using nuclear weapons to come to the defence of Finland or of the Baltic states. So Is the next logical step now for Poland to want to get nuclear weapons to keep the Russians at bay?
Yeah, look, I think this is a really critical question because one of the things we've learned, particularly from the Ukraine crisis, is how important nuclear weapons are in these big strategic confrontations. You know, after the end of the Cold War, the fear of global nuclear holocaust, which dominated the years of the Cold War so strongly, that fell away and people sort of started to forget about nuclear weapons. I think Ukraine has reminded us how important they are, and it's really critical for the countries of Europe as they decide, if we're not going to draw the line in Ukraine, where are we going to draw the line for Russians' aspirations to rebuild its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe? And I do think it would be possible for the Europeans to create a collective strategic identity which included a collective nuclear deterrent. But it would require a European government, really, a sort of unified European government that had the authority to use nuclear weapons to defend, so to speak, Europe's eastern boundary, wherever Europe decides to draw that line. But absent that, then individual countries like Poland, who naturally feel very exposed to future Russian aggression, will have to make a very painful decision for themselves as to whether or not they could trust that kind of structure, or absent that structure, whether they could trust France or Britain to use their nuclear weapons on Poland's behalf. And I'm not at all surprised that in Poland right now, in the last few months, a conversation has begun about whether Poland has to start thinking about its own nuclear deterrent. And I think, for what it's worth, a number of other countries, and not just in Europe, are going to have to start asking the same question.
Well, this is one of the nastiest bitter pills you think the world needs to swallow right now, which is the return of nuclear weapons to the centre stage. Here we are once more. You say the essential question for Europe at this point is, at what point are the Europeans prepared to use the threat of nuclear war to contain Russian expansionism?
Yes, and I mean, the reason I put it in that extremely gloomy way is that I think we've all learned a lesson, or we should have learned a lesson, from what's happened in Ukraine. To me, the most striking thing that's happened in this whole long and terrible war has been the time in late 2022 when Ukraine came closest to winning, when it had earlier in the year managed to push the Russian forces back from Kiev and back from Kharkiv. But in September and October 2022, they mounted a second series of very successful, inspiringly successful counter-offensives, which started to look like they were going to push, both on the northern and southern ends of the front, going to push the Russians right out of Ukraine. And at that point, Putin turned around and made them, by far and away, his most serious threats to use nuclear weapons. We now know, thanks to Bob Woodward's work, that in Washington at the time, they assessed the chance of Putin crossing the nuclear threshold as 50%. And that's a very scarily high figure. That didn't happen because Ukraine's offensives ran out of puff. But if they had continued, then I think the chances of Putin crossing the nuclear threshold were very high. And the problem, what that brought us to recognise, was that America couldn't effectively deter the Russians from doing that because it simply was not credible that America would fight a nuclear war with Russia that might involve attacks on American cities in order to defend Ukraine from Russia. That is the sort of reality of the new world. So the argument I'm making in the essay is that at whatever point the Europeans decide they want to constrain Russia's westward push, they are going to have to convince Russia not just that they're willing to fight a big conventional war, and that's very demanding, but they're willing to back that with a credible threat of nuclear retaliation if Russia tries to use nuclear weapons. Now, this is really scary, but it's the world we're in. Nuclear weapons never went away at the end of the Cold War. Their numbers reduced, but there are still thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons out there, and it's important for people to remember that they're there, ready to go right now. You know, the missiles are in their silos, the submarines are at sea. All of the machinery for a global nuclear catastrophe is ready to go, and we need to be very careful about the circumstances under which that might be put into action.
Bearing all that in mind, Hugh, during the Biden administration, I was wondering whether hardheads in the Biden administration had concluded the best possible scenario, as far as the United States was concerned, was a quagmire, an ongoing quagmire that would slowly bleed Russia's forces to death over the period maybe of 5-10 years or something. Not victory for Ukraine, certainly not victory for Russia, but an ongoing war of attrition and a quagmire that would pin Russia down and bleed it dry of its resources. Do you think they arrived at something like that conclusion?
Look, I think they did implicitly. Whether they were honest enough to admit to themselves that that's what they were doing is not clear to me. I don't have a very high regard for the senior people in the Biden administration as strategic analysts, frankly. But I think that was the clear implication of the decisions they made. It seemed to me that for a while, up until I think the middle of 2023, they hoped that somehow Ukraine could launch some massive offensives that would push the Russians out. They seem to have entertained the illusion that they could somehow deter Putin from responding to a catastrophic collapse on the battlefield by using nuclear weapons, though I think they had kind of acknowledged to themselves at the end of 2022 that they couldn't really do that. But ever since then, it seemed to me that they were, exactly as you say, hoping just to see the war drag on, bleed Russia white. But in the process, of course, they were bleeding Ukraine as well, and Ukraine had less blood to give. And so I think there was actually a lot of irresponsibility and a degree of cynicism in the way Washington, and for that matter the Europeans and the rest of us, left Ukraine fighting a war that they couldn't win. Now, it was only around about the middle of last year that the West started to acknowledge that some sort of negotiated settlement with Russia was going to be necessary. We now see this very painful process unfolding between Russia and Ukraine, with America standing on the sidelines, in which the basic outline of a deal, even at the most optimistic view of it for Ukraine, is that Ukraine is going to lose a good deal of territory and have very significant limits placed on the way in which it can relate to Europe, particularly strategically in terms of membership of NATO. This is a tragedy, and of course no one can be sure that any deal that's done will last for very long, because the next time Putin feels inclined to have a push, he'll return to the fight. Eventually, the Europeans are going to have to decide whether they are willing to get in there and actually defend the rest of Ukraine, but they won't succeed in doing that unless they can convince Putin that they're willing to use nuclear weapons to deter Putin from using nuclear weapons if the conventional battle goes against him.
We were talking before of Donald Trump's view of China, which is to see it, not be so troubled about it as a strategic rival, but as an economic rival. What hope do you have for the Trump administration forming an effective response to the challenge from China?
I'm very pessimistic that the Trump administration is going to prevent China pushing America out of East Asia and leaving China as the leading power in East Asia and the Western Pacific. One of the reasons for that is that Trump himself doesn't really see that as an American priority. Trump is very focused on China as an economic rival. He's very focused on what he sees as all the jobs, the manufacturing jobs that China has stolen from America over the last 25 or 30 years. That's why he's very focused on his trade war with China. But I've never seen Trump express a strong view about China as a strategic rival. He never makes the case that Joe Biden used to make, for example, that America's in a contest with China for the soul of the 21st century. In fact, he often shows that he's got a lot of respect for China and a lot of respect for Xi Jinping. In a sense, his view of Xi Jinping is quite benign. He sees it as quite legitimate that China wants to exert the same kind of influence in China's backyard that America exerts in America's backyard.
In fact, you quote him several times here. Again and again he says, quote, "I respect China,"
yes.
or China as he calls it. "I very much respect President Xi. President Xi is brilliant. The press hates when I call President Xi brilliant, but, well, he's a brilliant guy.
Yeah.
I want China to do great. I do. I love China," says Donald Trump.
And all of those are quotes just from last year. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I mean, he keeps coming back to this, and I mean, I think it's a feature of Trump's personality. I think he's very attracted by strong figures. He likes to see himself reflected in these tough guys like Xi and Putin. But I think it's also deeper than that. I mean, his rejection of the idea that America has an interest in defending Japan or defending South Korea goes all the way back to the 1980s. He's always been down on the idea of America taking responsibility for other people's security. And as far as he's concerned, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Southeast Asians, and Australia can look after themselves. It's not America's problem. And so I think the chances of him pushing back effectively against the sorts of challenge that China poses is very low. But of course, that's not the only factor, because Joe Biden didn't push back effectively against the Chinese either. Neither, for that matter, did Barack Obama. So Trump's failure to do that is not really what distinguishes him from his predecessors. The difference is he doesn't pretend that he is.
So there's the gift of clarity there, at least, with Donald Trump.
Well, put it this way, it makes it easier for us and other US allies to recognise what's actually going on.
So much hangs on the threat China poses for Taiwan's independence. Taiwan is a whole other way of being Chinese in the world. It's a place with proper democracy that's been in place now for several decades. There's freedom of speech, human rights, has all those things that the United States used to champion, but it remains under threat from invasion from mainland China. The last time you were here, you were talking about how it was your belief that if push came to shove, if China launched an invasion of Taiwan, whoever the US president was, he or she would be presented with this terrible dilemma, which is, do we come to the aid of Taiwan? Do we fulfill our promise to come to its aid militarily? And in doing so, would they be prepared to risk a nuclear conflagration with China? Has your view on that changed, Hugh?
No, Richard, it's got darker, in fact. I think over the years, China's conventional military capabilities, particularly its air and maritime capabilities, have grown, and its nuclear capabilities have grown relative to the United States. And so as that's happened, the cost and risk to the United States of going to war with China over Taiwan has increased. The prospects that the United States could win such a war have dwindled. The chances that such a war, if it breaks out, turns into a nuclear war has increased. And therefore, the choice the United States would face in that situation has become harder and harder. Now, this would be true whoever was in the White House. So on the one hand, the arguments in favour of going to war to defend Taiwan remain as strong as ever. Exactly the reasons that you mentioned. It's a flourishing democracy. It's a lovely place. It's one of the nicest places in Asia, in my experience. And it would be heartbreaking to see that democracy snuffed out by it falling under the sway of Beijing. On the other hand, we do have to be realistic about the costs on the other side. Going to war with China to defend Taiwan would not succeed in defending Taiwan. It would guarantee a war which would almost certainly be the biggest war since World War II and would very likely be a nuclear war, the first full-scale nuclear war. That would not end well for Taiwan or for the rest of us. It's characteristic of the very tough moral choices that we do face in this situation, rather like the choice we face in relation to Ukraine. You could say that, well, we should be prepared to go in there and actually fight for Ukraine if that's what's required. But the prospects that would lead to a nuclear war with Russia are very real. These are the choices we face. It's a hard new world, as I say.
So if I'm Xi Jinping in Beijing and I'm looking at the Trump administration who launched these audacious new tariffs of what did it go up to 145% at one point, then to see Trump back down and jump up and go backwards and forwards to fold pretty much, he would be thinking that Trump doesn't have much resolve. Would he be therefore more encouraged looking at the Trump administration and adding that to Trump's clear lack of interest in what were once the United States' strategic interests in East Asia and in the Western Pacific? Would he be encouraged to go ahead with an invasion of Taiwan?
Yes, he could easily conclude that, and he must be very tempted to do that. And if he did that, he would, I think, potentially at least believe that he would potentially reap a huge dividend, because if the United States failed to come to Taiwan's defence, it would undermine the credibility of America's position throughout the region, and for that matter globally. But from China's point of view, it would undermine Japan's confidence in the US alliance, South Korea's confidence in the US alliance, and I might say it would also undermine our confidence in the US alliance, and it would discredit the United States as a key strategic player throughout Southeast Asia. That would be a massive step forward towards the United States withdrawing from Asia, which is the outcome that Xi Jinping is after. It could easily see the collapse of the US-Japan alliance, the US-South Korea alliance. And so the temptation for Xi Jinping to call America's bluff, to take military action, to prove that the United States is not willing to do what it takes to push back against China would be a huge benefit. And so I think the temptation for Xi must be very great. On the other hand, there'd always be a risk for Xi in acknowledging that even with Donald Trump, there's always a risk that the president would, on the spur of the moment at 3 o'clock in the morning, when the decision would have to be made, make the other choice. And of course, with Donald Trump, you'd have to be particularly careful that he might just do something stupid and unpredictable in the middle of the night, because that's the kind of guy he is. So I think there'll always be an air of caution in Beijing about that, and you can, so to speak, turn the coin over as far as Trump's concerned and look at the other side. If you're Xi Jinping, you look at Trump and you say, look, this bloke is doing my work for me. He's undermining the alliance with Japan. He's undermining the alliance with South Korea. For that matter, he's undermining the alliance with Australia. I don't have to do anything.
What's that old phrase of Napoleon's? Never interrupt your enemy when he's in the middle of making a mistake.
Exactly, and that is exactly it. And so my sense is that there is a heightened risk that Xi will decide that Trump is just a guy whose bluff you want to call. But there's also, I think, a prospect, and this is an optimistic glimmer, if you like, that he will believe that exactly the Napoleonic principle will apply, that Trump is doing such a good job of destroying America's alliances in Asia and withdrawing America from the region, that there's no reason for Xi to take the risk and pay the cost of launching an invasion when I think he'd then hope that Taiwan will, so to speak, fall into his lap anyway.
Well, this brings us to AUKUS. Now, the new defence arrangements that were established by the Biden administration between Australia, the US and the UK. How much of AUKUS's raison d'etre, the whole reason for it for being, was thought at the time under the Biden administration to be about the containment of China and the defence of Taiwan? And where does this leave us now when we see the United States that it's hard to believe in their genuine commitment to Taiwan in the event of an invasion?
Look, I think it's AUKUS from America's point of view was all about tying Australia in to the Biden administration's desire to project itself as determined to push back and contain China's challenge in East Asia. The problem the Biden administration had is that they were completely committed to the idea that America needed to remain the dominant power in East Asia, but it had no capacity, no intention to sell to the American people the kind of massive effort that would have been required to make that real. And so what it looked for was kind of symbolic things that could convey the impression that they were doing a great deal to contain China without actually costing them very much. And AUKUS became the jewel in that crown. It wasn't costing America anything. In fact, they were being paid to do it. But it constituted a kind of ironclad commitment that Australia was going to support the United States in whatever the United States did in pushing back against China. Now, I thought that was a very bad step for Australia to take, because I don't think aligning ourselves with that Biden administration US policy towards China was going to work for us, because I didn't think the policy was going to work for the United States, and it was going to raise the risk that the US and China would find themselves in exactly the kind of confrontation over Taiwan that we were just talking about. And so I think it was a really dumb alignment with a US policy which seemed to me to make no sense. Now, the reason that Morrison did that, of course, was that Morrison simply couldn't conceive of Australia making its way in an Asia that wasn't dominated and made safe for us by American power. So he thought, we kind of had no choice. I mean, I think he also wanted to wedge the Labor Party on it. Well, the fact is that Labor followed him down the same path, and what we saw, at least in the first term of the Albanese government, was a just as strong and equally strong commitment to the idea that the only possible future for Australia in Asia was in an Asia which continued to be dominated by the United States. Now, that's the kind of obsession that we need to encourage our political leaders to get over, because that's just not the world we live in. I mean, the other point to make, of course, is that AUKUS was also a way of buying submarines, which I think was a really dumb way to buy submarines, because I don't think we need nuclear-powered submarines, and I'm very sure we're not going to get them. But that's a kind of whole separate part of the story.
What kind of a new relationship should Australia be aiming for with the United States? Is this time for us to walk away from the ANZUS? Is it even an alliance? I don't even know how you'd really describe the ANZUS agreements or the ANZUS understanding between us and the United States. It's not ironclad, supposedly, like NATO. Is it time for us, Australia, to walk away and forge a new relationship with the United States by your reckoning, Hugh?
Well, look, the first point I'd make is I do think the alliance with the United States has been enormously beneficial for Australia for a very long time. I spent half my career working in government, and a very high proportion of that I spent working away in the engine room of the US alliance, and was very proud to do so. Was then, and this is now. And I think the key point to make is it's not Australia that's walking away from the ANZUS alliance. It's the United States that's walking away from it. ANZUS is all about from America's point of view, it's all about Australia helping to support America's position in the Western Pacific. If America is no longer trying to sustain a position in the Western Pacific, then ANZUS makes no sense for America. And that's what America is walking away from. It's walking away from it explicitly under Trump. It was clearly walking away from it implicitly under Obama and Biden and so on. And so I do think that the question is not should we walk away from ANZUS, it's how should we respond to the reality that America is walking away from it. Now, I do think that one of the problems people have in thinking their way through this reality is that the alliance with the United States has dominated our thinking about our place in the world for so long, and also dominated our thinking about our relationship with America for so long, that we simply can't imagine what it would be like for us to have a relationship with the United States which wasn't built on the kind of alliance we've had in the past. Now, I think this is just a lack of imagination. Of course, America's going to remain an incredibly powerful country, which will be incredibly important to Australia in all kinds of ways, and we should be aiming to build a new post-alliance relationship with the United States. Just as when the alliance with Britain collapsed after the Second World War, we built a new post-alliance relationship with Britain. We no longer depended on Britain for our security, but we still had very big links with the UK, lots of connections in all kinds of ways. We should recognise that we can build a new kind of relationship with the United States, which we want to make sure is as beneficial as possible. And part of that is to make sure that we don't keep pretending to ourselves that we've got an alliance which is fading away, which is disappearing, coming apart in our hands. We should face up to the reality and try and build a new relationship based on a genuine recognition of where our respective interests and motivations lie now.
As I was reading your quarterly essay, Hugh, I couldn't help but be reminded by Australia in the 1930s. Now, this is all with the benefit of hindsight, of course. I don't know if I want to be too harsh, but I have to say, reading about Australia's leadership right across the board in the 1930s, you can't help but feel this kind of fury at the inability of our leaders back then to see the changing realities of world power. Britain had been greatly weakened by the First World War. Britain went into war with Nazi Germany, and it was fighting for its life. And yet there was still this belief that Britain would be insane enough to send a huge chunk of the Royal Navy out to Australia to defend it against Imperial Japan. The need to cling to that belief held on until we got the shock of our lives after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and on northern Australia in Darwin and Broome. And that's when, of course, we in a rather panicked way turned to the United States. Are we going through a similar time where our leaders just aren't seeing the reality of the new world that they're living in?
Yes, I do, Richard. I think it's an analogy which is extremely important to us. And it's very striking to me how allergic many people in Canberra are to that analogy precisely because it's so powerful. The fact is, Australia knows all about alliance failure because the failure of our alliance with Britain, the failure of them to come to our defence in 1941, 1942, and precisely as you say, our failure to recognise years in advance, you could say decades in advance, that was going to happen as Britain's relative power in Asia declined and the relative power of Asian great powers, in that case Imperial Japan, increased. It's exactly the kind of transition we're seeing at the moment. Right at the foundation of these big questions is how is the distribution of wealth and power between countries shifting? We failed to see that in the 1920s and 1930s. We're failing to see it again. Now, I don't want to take the extra step and say that China will end up posing to Australia the same kind of threat that Imperial Japan posed in the 1940s. But I do think our political leaders in the 1930s were willfully blind to the fact that the Britain on whom they continued to depend for our defence simply did not have the power, or for that matter the motivation, to come to Australia's aid when they were engaged in a great war in Europe. And the fact that political leaders, including Churchill, kept on telling Australians that they would send a huge fleet to fight in this part of the world to defeat the Japanese when they knew themselves that they couldn't do it. You can blame the British for misleading us, but I think I put more blame on the Australians for failing to see what was happening and failing to respond effectively with the imagination required to position Australia to look after itself.
Yeah, which is why when Curtin made that plea, we looked to America. That plea seems so important in our history. We now know within the Roosevelt White House was greeted with a lot of eye rolling.
Yes, exactly.
So standing outside of what the United States might want of us or expect of us right now, how should Australia be redirecting our defence resources that we have in a way that serves us best in this hard new world that you describe?
Look, I think the answer to that is pretty straightforward. First of all, we don't want to exaggerate the threat. You know, when a small task group of Chinese ships sailed around Australia a few months ago, there was a sort of a great upswell that China was threatening Australia directly. You know, that's not right.
It's more about making a point, wasn't it?
Well, it was. It was a bit of diplomatic communication, and it was pretty effective, you know, that take China seriously as a regional power, which we should. But it didn't threaten Australia militarily. But I do think we're living in a world in which the potential for China or other great powers to threaten Australia in the decades ahead will grow as America's power in the region declines. And that we do now have to make a choice as to whether we want as a country to be in a position to defend ourselves independently from the forces that a major Asian power could project towards us, or whether we're going to take what one might unkindly call the New Zealand option and just hope for the best. Now, if we're serious about the first, well, I mean, don't laugh, because on our present trajectory, that's where we're heading. If we keep spending the kinds of money we're spending at the moment and spend them as foolishly as we're spending them at the moment on things like AUKUS and some other big investments we're making, which I think make no operational sense in the modern world, then we will end up like New Zealand. We'll just be spending more money but not getting much more strategic effect. But if we spend our money wisely, and we do have to spend more, but not unimaginably large sums of money, something like 3%, maybe 3.5% of GDP on defence, and we spent it wisely, Australia could, I believe, defend ourselves independently from the forces that a major Asian power could project against us, and that should, and we don't have much time to get there, so we should start focusing on that. Now, that requires a lot more discipline in the way we think about what we want our armed forces to do, what kind of operations they need to undertake to do it, what kind of capabilities can best undertake those operations. Now, I don't think we've been nearly analytical enough about that in the recent past, and that's partly because Australian governments have been very confused about whether they're building the ADF, building an Australian Defence Force, to support America in a war against China or to defend ourselves. And there's a very big difference between the kinds of forces you need. The first of those is you need a force that can project power against China. The second is you need a force that can stop the Chinese projecting power against us. These are fundamentally different strategic objectives with fundamentally different operational priorities attached to them, and we need to really clarify that. And of course, I think we need to go for the latter.
You say that, Hugh, the possibility of Chinese or foreign invasion of the Australian mainland is pretty low. So is our major strategic interest then to defend our trade lanes, our shipping lanes that approach Australia? I mean, do we need to make ourselves a kind of a porcupine that's just too painful for any foreign power to want to swallow?
Look, I do think that the chance of a prospect of direct attack on Australia is very low. We are an inherently secure country, partly because we're so far from the main centres of power, partly because we're so big, which makes us very hard to swallow, and also because we're surrounded by all that water, which is, that the fact that Australia has such a maritime strategic environment is a very big strategic asset to us if we build the forces to exploit the opportunities that gives us effectively. But I won't go so far as to say that Australia could face no threat of a direct attack against us. I do think there's a risk, not this year, even this decade, but in future decades, that the great powers of Asia, and again, it's not just a China story, there's China, there's India, there's Indonesia, these are all going to be great powers, and great powers throughout history have tended to use their elbows pretty freely when they've felt the need, and just look at the way the United States has used our armed force in the last few decades. I don't think we can be complacent about that risk. I think a full-scale invasion is very unlikely, partly because we're so big, but I don't think we can dismiss the possibility that we would face a direct attack on Australia, but I don't think we need to exaggerate that threat, and I don't think we need to exaggerate what it would take us to respond to it. I think, on the other hand, defending trade is extremely difficult. People often talk about defensive trade as if it's sort of World War II and we're refighting the Battle of the Atlantic. The fact is that the scale of trade that Australia undertakes is vast, the sheer number of shipping movements involved. And even if you just focus on the most vital, there are thousands and thousands of ships every year, for example, bringing fuel to Australia. And our capacity to defend them is minuscule. The government's, at the moment we have 6 submarines. Of those, you might have 3 in service at any one time, if you're really lucky. And they go too slowly to escort ships anyway. I don't think there's a viable operational option for defending Australia's trade if another country really wants to attack it. And we'd just be wasting our money building lots of ships, pretending that that's going to allow us to defend our trade, when, in fact, it won't have that effect at all.
So what are you calling for then, Hugh?
I think the core focus of Australia's defence investment needs to be on building forces which can prevent other countries projecting power by sea and air against Australia. And that's a very sort of clear, specific operational priority, and it's one that accords with the drift in military technology. It's a lot easier these days to stop somebody else projecting power against you than it is to project power against them. And I think that should be the focus of our maritime defences. The best way we can respond to the possibility of a threat to Australian trade is not to try and defend our ships, but to put ourselves in a position of sinking other people's ships so that we can try to deter them from sinking ours. Now, that's, I think, I don't think that's as simple as that formulation I just used makes it sound, perhaps. But I do think that as part of what I call a maritime denial strategy, Australia could build the capabilities which would allow us to hold other people's trade at risk so that we could deter them from holding our trade at risk.
As always, Hugh, it's completely fascinating speaking with you, and thank you so much for taking on this kind of tour de horizon or tour de force through this hard new world we find ourselves living in. Thank you so much, Hugh.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on the tour de horizon.
Hugh White is the author of Hard New World, Our Post-American Future. It's the latest quarterly essay. Today's conversation with Hugh White was recorded on the lands of the Gadigal people. The producer was Jen Leake. Executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.